Hey everyone, ahlan wa sahlan fikum. Today we're going to talk about a very practical topic, the weather. Not only are we going to learn some really useful words for weather patterns and so on, but as always we're going to take a deeper dive into how we talk about the weather, what expressions we use, and why they work the way they do. Let's dive into that right now. Let's start a discussion with some vocabulary, which we'll then use to explore the ways we talk about the weather in Palestinian Arabic. Obviously, the first thing you need to know is the word for weather in Arabic. In standard Arabic, the word is it-toqs, literally meaning the weather. In the dialect though, the more common word to use is il-jaw, which technically means the air or the atmosphere. But this word is much more versatile in the dialect because it's not just used for the weather, but rather it can refer more metaphorically to the ambience or vibe of any place. It reminds me of English expressions like the political climate or the atmosphere at the cafe. In Arabic too, the word il-jaw can be used very flexibly and figuratively. So the question we're going to be answering today is, Kif il-jaw? To start answering that question, let's start with two very basic terms, bard and shob. While bard is the same in standard Arabic, shob is unique to the dialect, but it specifically refers to the weather or the temperature of a place. In fact, the standard word sukhon is still used in the dialect, but it's used for things like the temperature of food or water, or basically anything aside from the weather. So we have bard and shob. But how do we actually use them in a sentence? Well, we can start off by saying il-yom bard or il-yom shob. So that's pretty simple, but as usual, there's more we can say about this. Firstly, these are terms referring to temperature and the weather, but they don't refer to the feeling of being cold or hot. For that, we use the fa'alan pattern that's used for lots of different emotions and feelings, as in za'alan, jaw'an, or na'san. And likewise, we say ana bardan or ana shoban. Again, اليوم برد بس أنا بردان. اليوم شوب بس أنا شوبان. Anyway, I told you that اليوم برد means it's cold today. But what if I just wanted to say it's cold, period? Now we have a problem. Is it هو برد? Not quite. You see, in English, most expressions involving the weather use what's called a dummy pronoun that doesn't actually refer to anything. For example, it's raining. Okay, what's raining? Well, nothing really. This is actually a common feature of European languages, but in Arabic it doesn't work the same way. In Palestinian Arabic, the subject of sentences about the weather is actually specific. It's id-dinya, the world. So il-yom bard means it's cold today, but id-dinya bard means the world is cold, or simply it's cold. This is definitely the most important concept of today's video because I'm about to show you how we can use it to say tons of different things. But before that, there are two things I need to tell you. The first is that id-dinya is actually a feminine noun. What that means is that as soon as we introduce a verb into the sentence, it has to be in the feminine form. So id-dinya bard means it's cold, but if I want to say it got cold using the verb sar, it's actually sarat id-dinya bard. But it's important to keep in mind that in Arabic the subject is often dropped when there's a verb in the sentence. So this would become sarat bard. The reason this is important is because you might want to translate, for example, it was cold as kan bard. But that's not quite right because in Arabic the verb is not referring to the vague it that we use in English. It refers specifically to id-dinya, so it must be kanat bard or sarat bard. The second thing I wanted to point out is that since id-dinya is feminine, you might be wondering, why is id-dinya bard? Shouldn't it be barda in the feminine? That would be a very good observation, but the truth is a bit tricky. This bard is actually not an adjective, but rather a noun that doesn't change gender, like saying the cold or coldness. It might seem strange to say that id-dinya bard means the world is coldness, but actually the same very simple phrasing using nouns is actually how we can talk about many other weather patterns in Palestinian Arabic. For example, how might we say today is sunny? In English, we use the adjective sunny, but in Arabic, it's even easier than that. We start off with the noun ish-shams, meaning the sun, and all we need to do is use the same formula. Il-yom shams. It literally means today is sun, but it's really just another way of saying today is sunny. We can also say, for example, il-mafrud tkun shams bukra. It's supposed to be sunny tomorrow. As you can see, the verb can is conjugated in the feminine form because what's going to be sunny tomorrow is id-dinya. We can use the word it-talj in the same exact way too. It's snowy today, il-yom talj. In fact, we can use this phrasing for other types of changes in the environment, even when just talking about night and day. So it became nighttime would be sarat id-dinya layl. Now what about rain? In standard Arabic, the word that's used is il-matar, and while it can be used in the dialect, instead I want to practice the more Palestinian word for rain, which is ish-shita. If this looks familiar, that's because it comes from the standard Arabic word for winter. In Palestine, winter is literally synonymous with rain because while it doesn't rain almost at all for most of the year, some towns like Ramallah actually get more rain during the winter than London gets throughout the entire year. So whether or not it's technically winter, when it's raining, you say اليوم شتاء, it's winter today. Okay, so that's the easiest way to talk about the weather. Use the word الدنيا or اليوم as the case may be, and attach a noun such as شمس or شتاء. Just remember that any verb must be in the feminine form, even if the word الدنيا is not explicit. So even in the sentence اليوم راح تكون برد, the can becomes تكون because the full sentence is actually اليوم الدنيا راح تكون برد. But this isn't the end of the story. Although this is the easiest way, there are other ways to talk about the weather, namely using verbs and adjectives derived from them. After all, اليوم شتاء is like saying it's rainy, not it's raining. To see how it's done, let's take it step by step. In Standard Arabic, the verbs for the most common weather patterns are in form 4. So the verb for shams is ashmas, and the verb for talj is atlaj, and so on. Just remember that in the dialect, matar is mostly replaced by shita. So in addition to amtar, there is ashta. In reality though, we don't like to use form 4 in the dialect, and instead we really like to use form 2, as in shammas, tallaj, and shatta. The thing is, some of these form 2 terms already have other meanings coming from Standard Arabic. For example, in the dialect, we prefer to say tallaj rather than atlaj, but thallaj already exists in Standard Arabic, meaning to freeze. So theoretically, the term can mean both things. Likewise, since shatta comes from the word for winter, it means to rain, but it can also mean to start being winter. Even shammas has another meaning, to make something get sun, or to lay something out in the sun. In fact, the form 5 version, it's shammas, means to make yourself get sun, or rather to lay out in the sun or to sunbathe. Anyway, just remember that if you do use these verbs to talk about the weather, for example, it's raining, remember that in the dialect, it's the world that is raining. So instead of shatta, it should be الدنيا شتت or الدنيا بتشتي. But there is one really critical point. Rather than conjugating these verbs as usual, it's more common to use their active participles to convey the ongoing action of raining, for example. It's the same idea as with movement verbs like rah. Unless you're talking about a habitual action, instead of أنا بروح, I go, we say أنا رايح على مكان, I'm going somewhere. Likewise, you can say بتشتي كتير هالأيام, it rains a lot these days in a general sense, or otherwise you can use the active participle to say الدنيا مشتية, it's raining right now. And notice that since active participles are like adjectives in that they match gender and number, الدنيا is مشتية in the feminine rather than مشتي, which is the neutral form of the word. Anyway, the use of active participles is true of weather patterns in general. So rather than using the verbs directly, we say الدنيا مشمسة, it's sunny, or الدنيا متلجة, it's snowing. Actually, now I can show you another word that I haven't mentioned. الدنيا مغيمة, it's cloudy. From مغيم, to be cloudy, which itself comes from غيم and غيوم, meaning clouds. The use of active participles to speak about the weather actually applies in Standard Arabic too. For example, the official term for sunny is mushmis, which is actually the active participle of ashmas. In that sense, mushmis is not exactly the adjective sunny, but rather the ongoing action of being sunny. Likewise, mutlij, the active participle of atlaj, technically doesn't mean snowy, but rather the ongoing action of snowing. Anyway, mshamse and mtalje are the more informal terms, whereas mushmis and mutlij are slightly more formal. It's still perfectly fine to use mushmis instead of mshamse though, but for now I actually slightly recommend against using the official terms, and I've just hinted as to why. The situation regarding gender can get a bit confusing sometimes. See, the word mshammis is most often seen in the feminine form mshamse, because in the dialect the underlying subject is الدنيا. However, this doesn't apply in Standard Arabic. That's why you see mushmis in the masculine. What's confusing is that even if you're speaking in the dialect overall, it's as though the underlying grammar slightly shifts because you've introduced a word from a speech register that uses a different underlying grammar. It's an interesting phenomenon from a linguistic perspective, but learners might want to stick to dialect words and their feminine forms for now for the sake of consistency and simplicity. So now you can try to answer the question. كيف الجو عندك اليوم؟ مشمسة ولا مشتية؟ وكيف المفروض يكون بكرة? I hope today's episode was helpful because although talking about the weather shouldn't be very difficult, there are lots of things going on that without a proper explanation could be very confusing. So let me know if you have any questions, or otherwise I'll see you next time.
اهلا حبايبي وشكرا للجماعه اللي بيحضروا القناه. اذا بدكم تكملوا تشوفوا هالفيديوز اعملوا سبسكرايب، واذا شفتوني مؤخرا تفضلوا روحوا شوفوا الفيديوز الماضيه بالبلاي ليست، وتذكروا اني عملت مصادر لتعلم اللهجه الفلسطينيه تقدروا تلاقوها بالموقع تبعي اللي مكتوب تحت بالديسكربشن، ونشوفكم المره الجايه.